Hi students, so currently you are working on an assignment called Jim's Humanity where we're focusing in on the character Jim from the novel The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And we're specifically looking at whether or not Twain has unintentionally used blackface in his portrayal of Jim. And essentially what that means is the idea that has Mark Twain portrayed Jim as being a foolish character, one who is being made fun of and treated as less than intelligent. And if Mark Twain is, why this is very problematic. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about the background of blackface, and then you will apply this to your study of the Jim character. And let's get started. So if you take a look at our opening slide, this comes from an article called The Humanity Behind Jim's Blackface Mask. And I'm going to read through the author, Daniel R. Ridgewood of New Jersey. I'm going to read through his thesis, and in his thesis, what point of view concerning minstrelies does the author share? Okay, so let's give it a read. A popular form of entertainment in the mid to late 19th century, blackface minstrelies featured white performers who provided comedy by literally painting themselves black and mocking black humor, dance, speech, and music. Adopting a strategy of subversion, Twain, through blackface, criticizes racism and stereotypes about blacks by proving that these blackface portrayals are highly inaccurate. Through the character Jim, Twain exposes the humanity in black people and the need to treat them accordingly. So in this thesis, what is Ridgewood arguing? So Ridgewood is arguing that Mark Twain actually is writing against the concepts of blackface as opposed to utilizing blackface. So he says through Jim's character, we see that Jim is a human who deserves to be respected, and that Twain, by creating Jim, a character who's human and deserves respect, would go against the time period's use of blackface as entertainment. And so you as a reader need to consider whether you agree or disagree with Ridgewood. While you read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, did you find that Jim was a sympathetic character whose humanity was put at the forefront and who demanded respect from the readers? If you believe that Mark Twain succeeded in portraying Jim this way, then you would be in agreement with Ridgewood's thesis. If you believe that Twain didn't do enough to make us as readers see Jim this way, you might disagree with Ridgewood and actually say that Twain accidentally portrayed Jim through blackface. All right, let's move on to our next questions. So the next question is, what is blackface minstrelsy? We might not know what that actually means. And also, where did the term Jim Crow originate from? So let's take a look at this excerpt. It reads, many historians agree that blackface minstrelies as popular entertainment started with Thomas Rice's Jump Jim Crow, a song and dance routine in which Rice mockingly imitated an old crippled slave. Over time, as blackface minstrelsy became increasingly popular, whole troupes of actors specializing in blackface prepared shows that most often opened with an assorted songs, breakdowns, and gags, followed by olio portion of novelty acts such as malapropistic stump speeches or parodic lectures, and concluded with a burlesque skit set in the South. And so here we have a definition of what blackface minstrelies are, and they have a direct connection with what Jim Crow, where the term Jim Crow originated from. So these were traveling shows in which they entertained audiences by, the actors entertained audiences by painting their faces black and making a mockery of black people. And so today we know that this is highly problematic, but during the time period, some people saw it as entertainment. And so the question that we have is whether Mark Twain effectively condemns this behavior, or if he recreated it through Jim's character. So there are some scenes in which we see Jim possibly acting in this way, where he's having conversations or he says things that make him seem less than intelligent. However, there are other parts of the book where Jim seems to be the most intelligent person in the room, far more intelligent than any other character in the book. And so we need to consider why Twain depicts Jim in different ways throughout the book. Is it because that Huck sees Jim differently as he begins to develop a relationship with Jim, and that actually there's no fault with Jim, the fault is with Huck and his own perception? Or do you perceive it a different way? It's up to you as the reader to decide. So we responded to these questions. Let's move on to our next excerpt and see what information it can offer. So knowing that the purpose of blackface is to debase blacks, one may naturally think that Twain's use of blackface to portray Jim undermines any criticism about slavery. In fact, blackface moments in Huck seem to even promote racism and negative stereotypes about blacks. So this is what I was talking about, where there are certain parts of the book in which it seems as though Twain is actually utilizing blackface and enforcing negative stereotypes. And we have to stop and try to understand these moments, try to figure out what Twain meant to do, but also to determine if it matters what he meant to do. Does it matter what he intended, or does it matter how the audience is perceiving it? And again, it's up to you, the reader, to try to figure out what you think about it. So let's talk about these questions. What are instances of blackface minstrelsy in the novel? Why are these perceived as offensive? And what was the satirical intent of Mark Twain in these scenes? So for the first question of what are instances in the novel, the one that first comes to my mind is in the very early chapters, where Huck and Tom play a trick on Jim by hanging his hat above his head on the tree and making him think that witches did it. And then Jim goes around and tells these increasingly absurd stories about how witches flew him all over town. And he goes around and brags about that. But then there's the dramatic irony, where we know that that is not, in fact, what happened. There's also the conversation that occurs between Jim and Huck, where they're arguing about Solomon. And when Jim gives his argument as to kind of what he thinks about Solomon, his language is very broken and confusing. What's interesting, though, is that Jim actually makes a very, very strong argument if you look at the content of it. But it's interesting that Twain made his dialect seemingly even more kind of strong and confusing in that moment of really excellent logic. And so we see these moments where Jim seems to be made a fool of. And so why are these perceived as offensive? So they're perceived as offensive because it's causing readers to perceive Jim as being less than intelligent. When later on in the novel, he becomes far more intelligent and caring. He takes care of Huck. He helps Huck survive the wilderness. He makes decisions that are important in saving their lives and their safe passage. We learn that he has a daughter who he loves very much, that he has dreams and goals, and he becomes a much more human character. At the very end of the novel, he even puts his own life and freedom in danger in order to save the boys. And so by the end, it's almost as though Mark Twain's writing about a completely different character. We don't see Jim as being foolish anymore. We see Jim as being the hero of the story. However, it could still be perceived as somewhat problematic. While Jim is no longer being treated as foolish, he also is entirely there to help the boys in the story, as opposed to take care of himself and take the lead and get back to his family, for instance. And so some people have a problem, even at the end, even when Jim is shown as being the hero, with the idea that it still seems to be in servitude to these two young white boys. And so it's still perceived as possibly being offensive. And so we need to consider what was the satirical intent of Mark Twain in these scenes. And so let's take a look at this next passage. So it reads, While Twain is among the few in the late 19th century to criticize the treatment of blacks, he also bends to social pressures to a degree. After all, his criticism through blackface is quite indirect. On this point, Bell finds Twain's desire not to isolate himself from his readers, who were passive or active participants in the rising tide of racial, political, and economic oppression, terrorism, and exploitation that swept the nation in the 1870s and 1880s, to be one of the reasons for this indirect blackface criticism. Not until his later essays like The United States of Lyncherdom does Twain finally emerge from behind his own mask and more directly attack the racism against blacks. And so what Ridgewood argues is the fact that the reason why we have so much trouble pinpointing what it really is that Twain wants to do is because Twain wasn't doing it openly enough. Twain was criticizing the treatments of blacks during this time period, but he was still kind of giving in a little to the social pressures. He has later writings in which he much more explicitly condemns the actions of racist people during this time period. So what is Mark Twain's point of view in his writing, and how does his writing differ from Huck Finn? And we're talking about this piece, United States of Lyncherdom. What is his point of view, and how does it differ in point of view from Huck Finn? So let's take a read from a really quick excerpt from this later writing by Twain. So it reads, "There are not enough morally brave men in stock. We are out of moral courage material. We are in a condition of profound poverty. I believe that if anything can stop this epidemic of bloody insanities, it is martial personalities that can face mobs without flinching. And as such, personalities are developed only by familiarity with danger and by the training and seasoning which come of resisting it." And so here Mark Twain is writing directly about lynching, specifically the lynching of African and Black Americans. And he discusses how he's directly criticizing it and saying the fact that there's not enough people standing up against it, that we're out of brave people, out of brave men specifically. He's focusing on men. He says we're out of brave men who will actually stand up against these injustices, this epidemic of bloody insanities. His language is much stronger here and it's much direct. There's no confusion about what he believes and what he wants to happen. And so when we look at this in comparison to Huck Finn, we can see how Huck Finn is far more subtle. It's a lot harder to figure out what it is Mark Twain believes, as opposed to here where he directly states it. So hopefully this overview provided the information that you needed, not only to answer the questions in our document, but also to help you better understand the complexities of how we might feel about the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and why it is located on both banned book lists and also required reading lists. And now, just to give you a heads up, let's see what you're going to do next with some of this information. So in the following step, you're going to be given a website and also a video. The video does contain explicit language, so if that's going to bother you, you can skip that one. You don't have to watch the video, but you do at minimum need to read this website, and you will answer questions with both of those. So this is step 1 in that, and step 2, which is optional. And then you'll find in the next row, you will choose from one of 3 very quick kind of articles or blogs, and you will answer questions about them. So you can choose this one in which you would answer this question. You can choose this one in which you answer this question, or you can choose this one in which you answer this question. And so that's located here in this table. So I'm just giving you a heads up. We just went over these questions that you'll fill in an answer. And then next you will go through and answer these questions here. And then you have one more step afterwards, which you'll move on to next. So a lot of involvement with Jim so that you can figure out how you specifically feel about Mark Twain's portrayal of the character. I hope that this helped, and if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.